This is the story of how the Coors beer family started the right-wing Christian nationalist movement and how they're still funding it to this day.
Political bear nation ready to dive, where opinions spark and the debates thrive. Hold on tight.
Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Brown Chubby Bear, and this is Political Bear Nation. Most of you think of Coors as an iconic American beer in a silver can made in the Midwestern state of Colorado. Most people don't really associate the family with anything else but beer, and to their credit, they've done a great job of hiding their past and their politics. But that's what I'm going to uncover for you today. Let's start at the beginning. Adolf Hermann Joseph Coors, spelled K-U-H-R-S, was an immigrant from Germany. He came here as a 21-year-old orphaned stowaway. But back in 1868, immigration laws were still pretty forgiving, so he was still able to be classified as a legal immigrant. But he was so ashamed that he had to hide on a ship instead of paying for his way that he forbid his family to ever talk about it. When he arrived in New York City, he changed the spelling of his last name so he could assimilate to his new country. He started working as a laborer, and just 5 years later, he was able to purchase an old abandoned tannery along with another German immigrant. They purchased a Pilsner recipe and started a brewery. 7 years later, he bought out his partner and renamed the brewery the Adolf Coors Golden Brewery. Coors was incredibly innovative. While Prohibition, which banned alcohol, didn't start nationwide until 1920, in Colorado, it started in 1916. So, Coors pivoted into creating malted milk. Much of that was sold to the Mars Candy Company to produce sweets. He even created a ceramics company by using local mining resources right in Colorado. During this time, he had 8 children, although 2 of them died as infants. He had 3 boys and 3 girls that survived. Now let's fast forward a bit. Adolf Coors III, grandson of the founder, took over most leadership duties by the mid-1950s. In 1958, he was officially named the CEO, and his 2 brothers worked alongside with him. One brother, William K. Coors, was the VP of Engineering and Research and invented the recyclable aluminum can that would turn into the iconic Coors Silver Bullet. Another brother, Joseph Coors Sr., had various executive roles in operations, management, and marketing. On February 9, 1960, Adolf Coors, the company's CEO and heir to the Coors family fortune, which is worth at least $100 million back then, which would make it about $1 billion today, was kidnapped. The following day, his wife Mary received a ransom note in the mail requesting $500,000 for his safe release, which would be equivalent to about $5 million today, accounting for inflation. The FBI launched one of the biggest manhunts since the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Now, I'm not going to get into all the crazy details of it because there are plenty of crime and mystery channels that have covered this specific incident, but here are the important parts for our purposes. Joseph Corbett Jr. was an escaped murderer, and he planned this kidnapping while he was in prison. He wanted to hold the Coors heir for ransom, but something happened on the bridge where Corbett tried to kidnap him. So instead of kidnapping him, he killed Coors instead. Corbett was arrested in Canada 2 years after the crime was committed, and he lived until 2009. But he always maintained his innocence, so the family nor did the police know what really happened. There was always a belief among the Coors family that because of the ongoing tensions between union members and the company going all the way back to 1933, that unions created an atmosphere of distrust and hate towards the Coors family. And they believe that is what ultimately led to Corbett kidnapping the Coors heir. Now, there's zero proof of any of that, but remember that point because it will be important later on. Now, because the original CEO and Coors heir was killed, the brothers took over. William Coors became chairman of the board, and as executive vice president, Joseph Coors focused on operations, expansion, and finance. And even though the facility experienced a tragic event, business was doing really well. At this time, Coors was only marketed solely in the American West, in just 11 states. People would often travel to Colorado just to bring it back to the East Coast. It was incredibly popular. Coors couldn't sell their beer nationwide yet because they refused to pasteurize their beer. They believed in keeping it fresh, but that meant that their beer could only last a few weeks on the shelves.
Any beer can get get stale in your store. That's why Coors has the strictest policy to assure freshness.
Taste first, beer fresh, Coors after Coors.
Plus, they realized it created a false sense of scarcity which they could use in their marketing tactics. In 1977, a now famous movie, Smokey and the Bandit, portrayed Burt Reynolds illegally transporting Coors beer from Texas to Atlanta, Georgia. That movie made Coors more famous nationwide, even though most people couldn't even buy it.
The problem is that Coors beer, you take that east of Texas, and that's bootlegging.
But their popularity didn't come without some problems. Now remember I told you, the Coors distrusted unions. The company has had issues with them for nearly 30 years, and there was a small regional boycott since 1966. It was organized by American GI Forum, a congressionally chartered Hispanic veterans and civil rights organization. In addition to the boycott, they also believed union members could have assisted Corbett in his kidnapping attempt. This was their reasoning for requiring polygraph tests for all of their employees, but they didn't just ask questions to make sure these employees would be safe and loyal to the company. The Coors, Joseph Coors specifically, was staunchly anti-gay. When potential employees were hooked up to polygraph tests, he required them to tell the company if they were homosexual. If they were gay, they wouldn't be hired. Coors literally hooked people up to a machine to make sure they weren't gay before they were hired. Coors openly discriminated against gays, women, African Americans, and Latinos. While 11.6% of the Colorado population was Latino at the time, less than 2% of the Coors employees were actually Latino. This was not the first time Joseph Coors showed his hatred of Latinos, specifically to Mexicans. When he was on the governing board of the University of Colorado, he opposed creating a chapter of the United Mexican American Students Club, and he tried to block the creation of courses regarding Chicano studies. The blacks that did have jobs at Coors were only given the most menial positions with no chance to advance. The same was true for women. It was around this time that Joseph Coors became increasingly involved in right-wing politics. Seeing it as a way to protect his family's interests, in 1964, he became a major funder and supporter of Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Joseph also backed the campaigns of Orrin Hatch and Strom Thurmond. Here's a quick side note on both of these politicians just to refresh your memory. Orrin Hatch is known for proposing a constitutional amendment to reverse the Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion. He was also very anti-gay, saying, "I wouldn't want to see homosexuals teaching school any more than I'd want to see members of the American Nazi Party teaching school." And Joseph Coors backed everything that he stood for. Now, Strom Thurmond is known for having the longest filibuster in history to prevent the Civil Rights Act of 1957. That is, until Cory Booker broke his record earlier this year. Strom Thurmond was a staunch opponent of all civil rights legislation, and Joseph Coors backed everything that he stood for. And by the way, it wasn't just Joseph Coors that felt this way. In February 1984, while speaking at a minority business development seminar, his brother William Coors was quoted as saying that Africans lacked the intellectual capacity to succeed, and that one of the best things slave traders did for you is to drag your ancestors over here in chains. So this was the mindset of the entire Coors family. But let's get back to 1968. The next person Joseph Coors would back would be Ronald Reagan, but his bid to become the Republican nominee in 1968 failed miserably, and Reagan was forced to throw all his support behind Richard Nixon. At this point, Joseph Coors had financially backed multiple conservative candidates to become president, but they failed to win the presidency. So he decided to develop a think tank to reshape public opinion. So in 1972, he wrote a $250,000 check to begin the Heritage Foundation. That is nearly $1.8 million in today's money. Yes, the same people that brought you the silver bullet funded the Heritage Foundation, which Reagan followed to cut the federal government. And that's exactly what Heritage is doing right now with Donald Trump during this government shutdown. Back to 1981. The Heritage Foundation issued the first Mandate for Leadership handbook. That became the policy blueprint for the Ronald Reagan administration. Reagan worked with the Coors family and the Heritage Foundation to cut the EPA by 22% during his very first year. He tried to cut Title I spending by 50%, but ended up with a 12% reduction. Title I spending is specifically allocated for low-income, disadvantaged students. He cut Pell Grants by 36% over his full 8-year term. He also cut food stamps by $2 billion, the AFDC welfare program by over $1 billion, low-income housing construction was cut by $3 billion, and job training programs were cut by over $2 billion. And this is just a small sample of his cuts. This is the same policy blueprint that was updated for Project 2025.
Do you see any change in public policy as a result of your efforts?
Oh, I think so. Helping to start the Heritage Foundation, for instance, has been a major change, I think, in public policy. They were their mandate for leadership, which came out when Ronald Reagan was first elected, outlined for him some of the major programs that some of us conservatives felt were important for him to undertake in his administration.
Under Trump, 200,000 federal workers have already been cut. That's 48% of the Department of Education, 80% of the Office for Civil Rights, 24% of the Health and Human Services, and 100% of the 20 employees that used to work at the Voice of America. And we're not even a year in. I feel like you might need a moment to take that all in, so why don't you go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to this channel while you're screaming holy shit. Now, let's get back to the boycott, because for a long time, the Coors boycott was small and ineffective. Coors just didn't care. It wasn't until April 12, 1977, when 1,500 members of Local 366 went on strike to boycott the harsh terms of their employment, like pledging that you weren't a communist or that you weren't a homosexual. But this is where things get really, really interesting. Harvey Milk was an openly gay man and was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977. He was one of the first openly gay elected officials in the United States. He supported the boycotts because of the Coors family no gay policy. He also didn't like their funding of conservative groups that were opposed to gay rights. Not just the Heritage Foundation, mind you, but there were many others, and we'll get to some of those in just a moment. Because of Harvey Milk's support in the San Francisco area, the AFL-CIO took notice. Keep in mind at this point that Coors was still only selling to 11 states. Getting much of California to stop buying Coors was a huge development. Harvey's involvement showed the AFL-CIO that this wasn't just a small dispute within the union itself, but it had large community support. And that's when the boycott went from just a small regional issue in Denver to a national campaign against the Coors family. During the national boycott, Coors' market share dropped from 40% to just 17%. In order to end the decades-long boycott and strike, the Coors family finally made some concessions, like making it easier for unions to organize within the company. They stopped using polygraph tests to ask about your political affiliation or your sexual orientation. They agreed to implement equal opportunity hiring practices for both minorities and women. They made big financial commitments to donate to Latino, African American, and LGBT community organizations. The unions won, and Harvey Milk was a large reason why. Now that's a win, and part of me wanted to end the video right here, but it's important to realize that the Heritage Foundation wasn't the only far-right conservative group that the Coors family supported. There were a ton of right-wing Christian nationalist organizations that the Coors family funded and still do to this day. We're going to talk about just two of them. The Free Congress Foundation promoted socially conservative policies in the United States. Coors helped them influence elections, policy, and public opinion. But most importantly, they backed the founder, Paul Weyrich. Paul Weyrich didn't just create the Free Congress Foundation, he was the brains behind the Heritage Foundation and many other organizations that the Coors family supported. Another organization was ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council, and they create what they call draft legislation, and they give that to lawmakers. Not only do they financially back conservative politicians, they actually write up the legislation and hand it to the politicians, which then becomes law. Many times, politicians never even read the legislation that they're given that they put their own name on. And ALEC has written laws that have weakened labor rights, slashed taxes for the wealthy, and limit environmental and consumer protections. Remember that 1994 McDonald's hot coffee case where everyone made fun of an old lady for burning her private parts? In Layback versus McDonald's, the fast food chain was accused of serving coffee at dangerously high temperatures. Now, she won $3 million, and everyone from late-night comedians to right-wing radio hosts called the case frivolous.
If a lady goes to a fast food restaurant, puts coffee in her lap, burns her legs, and sues and gets a big settlement, that in and of itself is enough to tell you why we need to have tort reform.
Clamped it between her legs, drove down the street, spilled it, burned herself, sued McDonald's, and collected.
Now she claims she broke her nose on the sneeze guard at the Sizzler, bending over looking at the chickpeas.
Ooh, my coffee was too hot. It's coffee!
ALEC was one of the organizations that pushed the narrative that the McDonald's lawsuit was an example of a lazy American abusing the courts and costing corporations millions of dollars, which was then passed on to consumers. What most people don't know is that McDonald's coffee was served 30 to 40 degrees hotter than most other restaurants. When the jury saw the graphic photos of a 79-year-old woman that had third-degree burns over 16% of her body, which exposed her muscle and fatty tissue, they knew this was not a frivolous lawsuit. She was in the hospital for 8 days, and she required skin grafts and 2 years of ongoing treatment. What you also don't know is that she actually only asked for $20,000, mostly just to cover her medical expenses, but McDonald's refused and offered her just $800. The jury also learned that 700 other people had been seriously injured, including children. And in the end, the jury did award her $3 million, but ALEC made McDonald's look like the victim and made the 79-year-old grandmother look like a thief. ALEC and other conservative groups used this opportunity to change state laws so they could put a cap on damages. The public sided with McDonald's. I don't know why we as Americans tend to simp for billionaires, but we often do. ALEC was able to get those caps passed in states like Missouri and Oregon, and it had devastating effects. In Clark versus OHSU, a baby suffered permanent brain damage due to medical negligence. Clark was born with a congenital heart defect and underwent a successful surgery at the Oregon Health and Science University. But after the surgery, he was not placed with specialists who would have monitored him appropriately. And because of their negligence, he suffered prolonged oxygen deprivation, which caused permanent and severe brain damage. ALEC had helped change the state cap to just $200,000. He will need 24/7 constant care for the rest of his life due to the malpractice, but $200,000 won't go very far. Because of ALEC, 26 states put caps on what consumers can get from restaurants, 30 states put caps on medical malpractice, and they used the McDonald's court case as their poster child for frivolous lawsuits. The Coors family backed all of this. Paul Weyrich was the brains behind the Heritage Foundation, the Free Congress Foundation, the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Council for National Policy, and even Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. But this entire infrastructure traces back to Joseph Coors picking up the phone in 1972 and saying he wanted to fund the far-right conservative movement.
And that, plus the continued growth of Heritage and that operation, and also the Free Congress Foundation, which resulted really sort of a spawn of Heritage, because Paul Weyrich, who was the first president of Heritage, split off and started the Free Congress Foundation. So those two organizations, plus many more, have given me a great feeling of having done something to help turn the country, or move it in the right direction, as I call it.
And the Coors family still donates millions of dollars to the Heritage Foundation and other organizations to this day, ones that we don't even know about. I spoke about Leonard Leo's dark money group, Donors Trust, in a previous video. Donors Trust acts as an ATM for the conservative right. The Coors gave Donors Trust $5.4 million last year alone. And while the Coors family no longer runs the day-to-day business since they merged with Molson, they are still major shareholders in the Molson Coors Beverage Company. And every time you buy a Coors Light, a Blue Moon, or a Miller High Life, you put cash in their pocket. And that goes directly to right-wing Christian, nationalist, and conservative causes. Cold as the Rockies and heartless as a rock. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And check out my video about Leonard Leo or the one about fearing socialism.